Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's live webinar question and answer session with myself, Peter Alkema. It is Monday, the 29th of March, 1 o'clock in South Africa. Not too sure if we've everybody coming in only from South Africa, in which case that'll be the time for you as well. But please do let us know where you are joining us from. This session is primarily intended for the engineering faculty of the University of Pretoria here in South Africa, but we've made it open and available for anybody who's interested to join us today and learn about digital disruption. So a very warm welcome to you if you are joining us today. Please do pop a note in the chat, say how's it, and let us know what it is that you'd like to get out of the session today, and importantly, where you are coming from today, which university potentially, or however else it is that you found out about the session, and importantly, what questions you have about digital disruption. This is something that's hit us from all angles in all the different contexts that we have, both in our family lives, in on our work context, and certainly as students. Something that we want to absolutely get to grips with is digital disruption, so that as we go out into the workplace, we're well aware of what has been happening in the world around us. And I think over the last year or so, we've realized just how much digital is something that we can actually rely on when we have other existential type of threats, like a global pandemic, as we've experienced in coronavirus. So just as everybody's joining us today, and we're getting a few comments coming through on the live chat stream, let me just welcome my co-host, Calvin Smith from Tuckey's University. So Calvin, why don't you just give us a little bit of introduction to yourself? This is the third of 4 webinar series. We completed 2 of them a couple of weeks ago, where we looked at how to boost your job prospects, so how to position yourself for the workplace. And then second of all, once you're in the workplace and you have a job, how do you accelerate your career growth? And then the 2 this week, so today and Wednesday, is going to be on digital disruption and then digital transformation, i.e. how companies in particular are responding to digital transformation. So Calvin, over to you. Just give us some context to the sessions that you've arranged with your faculty and all the students there at Tuckey's, and what do you think are some of the burning questions regarding digital disruption these days?
Thanks so much, Peter, for again taking the time out of your day to come in and assist us students. We really appreciate it. So quickly, guys, I'm Calvin, head of professional development at for the EBIT faculty house at Tux. And we've just had 2 brilliant webinars a couple of weeks ago, and I got great feedback from that. And so this week, I think we could call it Digital Week, if that's an appropriate term. But this week is all about, guys, learning about what's really happening around us. And I think that's one of the traits of a good leader is knowing what's going on around you. And I'm hoping that today we can kind of just get a good sense of the big trends in the industry, in particular blockchain, Bitcoin, all those really nasty words. I think they really give us a lot of anxiety. I know they do. Know that I do get anxiety because I just want to understand them better. But I want us to have better dialogue about these things, and just artificial intelligence, cloud computing. These are all things we should know, no matter what industry you're going into, no matter what degree you're studying, because they're ubiquitous and they're changing the way we live and do things. So I'm really, really excited to have these 2 with Peter. There's no better person to get to squeeze some knowledge out of than you, Peter. You got skin in the game when it comes to this, a lot of experience. So yeah, really excited, and I hope you guys enjoy the next 2 webinars.
Thanks very much, Calvin. And if I could just ask that whoever has joined, if you guys could maybe just pop this URL on your groups and just remind your buddies to join us. Maybe they're still stuck at lunch or got other urgent studying to do. But obviously we'd like to benefit as many students as possible in today's session and in the next one on Wednesday. So as Calvin said, certainly is a digital week. And these 2 topics really do go hand to hand. You really got to sort of understand the digital disruption, as well as then the response to that disruption through the transformation aspect. So those of you that have joined the call, thank you very much. A warm welcome and a good afternoon to you. And if you could then just pop this link onto your student groups and maybe onto any email distribution groups that you have, just to remind people to hop on, that'd be great. Then we make sure that we give the maximum amount of benefit to everybody. I think let's get started in the meantime, as everybody's just coming online. And those that we do have listening in and watching today, please could you just give us a note in the comments, let us know where you're from, and then specifically your questions or thoughts around digital disruption as we go. And what I'd certainly like to do is pick up those questions as we go through the webinar. It just makes it a lot more interactive, and we can make it a lot more focused, so that those people that are here today and have made the time to join us will get the most benefit from it. So look, I mean, this is maybe this quote is a little bit outdated now, but it certainly formed the basis of my book and my course that I put together on digital disruption, which I will make available to you guys a little bit later on in the webinar. But if you look even pre-COVID, there was massive disruption that happened in the business landscape, and this was simply driven by the race for increased customer convenience, increased speed to market for products, the change in people's behavior, and how certainly digital natives weren't going to be filling in forms, they weren't going to be standing in queues. They would reward customers with their loyalty based on how well those companies actually delivered. If they swiped left or right or clicked a button, they expected something to happen according to their expectations. And it was those forces that were significantly disrupting the business world, largely since the year 2000, when we've had the exponential growth and some of the topics that Calvin mentioned started to impact on business models. And it was really a race as to who could adopt those and scale them to create the disruption in the market. So, disruption has come about as a result of increased competition and changes in business models that some companies were able to adopt quicker than others. And we'll talk about transformation in the next webinar. But digital itself is a disruptor because of the way it can be used by companies to have a competitive advantage. And the companies that are then left with those high cost bases and haven't adopted the digital processes and the digital business models are then left catching up. And you find a massive disruption in terms of companies that have relied on capital intensive businesses and heavy real estate portfolios and fleets of cars, etc., being disintermediated by over-the-top applications that focus on customer experience, customer ease of use, and a very low barrier to entry. If you've created marketplaces around those services for people to come and provide their own services into those marketplaces, meaning then that the facilitator of that marketplace or the owner of that platform doesn't then have to invest in that real estate or those fleets of cars, but are then very much wide open to being disrupted by an Airbnb or a Uber or any of these other types of marketplaces. And as we've seen and we've read in the literature, and we all have access to the same literature, the biggest car rental company in the world doesn't have any cars. The biggest accommodation provider doesn't own any hotels. The biggest media company in the world, Facebook, doesn't actually produce its own content. These are all marketplaces. These are all ecosystems facilitated by these digital platforms. And so that's the nature of the disruption that has been happening in the world even before COVID. And really, what we want to cover in this webinar, and what is really then the first half of my course called the Digital Masterclass, of which this is a snapshot of the first section. We'll look today really at the main digital winners and losers. And I've sketched some of the themes that have resulted in that churn or disruption that we've seen. We'll touch on some examples of those, and then we'll look at this growth, this exponential story where you have this very rapid increase in profits, in users, in impact, in customers, in product lines, a number of different metrics that experience exponential growth when a certain number of factors are in place. And often it's that early stage of the exponential growth where the recipe has to be carefully thought through. You invest in that, you build a platform, very much like Amazon was an overnight success that took 20 years in the making. And what a lot of people forget is that slow growth at the early stages of that exponential growth curve. And we'll unpack a little bit, what those concepts all mean and how companies can adopt them and use them to create almost unfair competitive advantage. But the reality is that many would say we're actually in the second half of the exponential growth that we've seen impacting the industry at large. and society. Calvin mentioned banking and financial services, so that's where I've spent my 25 years of my career in the working world, and we can touch on some of those aspects there in terms of blockchain and other things where telcos, for example, have been trying to get into payments. Banks have been trying to get into telecommunications, so it's all blurred, and the rules are changing. Some things have fallen away, some things have come back. Some things haven't changed. We'll unpack a lot of that and specifically understand what digital means for banking and financial services and really the future of finance. Great. So I see we've got some people joining us, and maybe we cut into their lunch a bit, but this is certainly a lunch and learn webinar. So great that we've got a couple more of you guys joining us. And please do put a note in the chat there. Just tell us where you're from and tell us what you want to learn about digital disruption. How's your lives been, affected by digital disruption? And as I say, I mean, let's then touch on it very quickly. This was all before 2020 and obviously the global COVID-19 pandemic, when as a result of that, we still needed to interact. We still needed to maintain contact and run businesses, and we surged onto digital platforms like Teams and Zoom and other meeting environments where we could then have these types of discussions, and we could continue to run businesses to some degree. Many businesses do rely on that physical interaction, and there was widespread disruption and in many cases failure across those industries that simply couldn't rely on digital to run their businesses. And I think a lot of that disruption is still going to play out. I think that a lot of those businesses that were initially hit by COVID couldn't respond as quickly as other industries that are more knowledge worker focused. So, I mean, if I look at First Rand, literally within a couple of weeks, we had relocated all our employees. We had all our call centers up and running. We pretty much, I'm actually in the office at the moment, but if I could tell you now in this whole building, there's maybe 10 people and the photocopiers are standing still. The cupboards are not used. There's stacks of paper on the desks. Nobody's going to come and use those again. You end up with this hyper dematerialization where what we thought was important previously to manage and run business processes, suddenly in a COVID environment, when you have to run everything remotely and your survival depends on it, actually places a different approach to it. And in order to survive, you have to go digital. And you get rid of the corner offices, you get rid of the photocopying machines, you get rid of the lever arch files, you get rid of the archives, you get rid of the forms that your customers have to fill in. So while we hadn't, I don't think, as banks necessarily done a great job in getting rid of the friction, that we put in front of our customers. And I can promise you now there's a lot of friction and frustration inside the banks. COVID sort of almost forced us to say, well, how much can we put onto our app? How much can we put onto our digital interaction interfaces? And although FNB, I think, had led the way in doing some of that for many years, we now realize just how important that had been, not only for us to be able to run our business, but for our customers to maintain their access to their financial products and services. So I think COVID has been an accelerator of digital transformation as well as a disruptor in its own right. And whereas before 2020, we all turned to digital to get advantage in terms of customer experience and low barriers to entry, etc. Now we were turning to digital for the sake of our business, for the sake of saving jobs, and for the sake of saving, the profit and customers that we had built up over many years. And so that, I think, really is just good context as we go into 2021. And Ayanda there mentioned on the group, she can't remember when last she was inside a bank branch, and I'm the same. And I think this is what we see is an example of what we've seen as the dematerialization of physical networks, physical interaction, physical mechanisms, physical processes that we have to follow to get the goods and services that we need as humans that still need to interact and run our lives. And we'll talk a little bit more about banking and financial service. So Ayanda, yes, thanks to banking app and online banking, it's not perfect, but the more that we're able to put on there, the easier it is for you guys to self-service and get access to your products and services. And then what I also talk about just in those last two lectures in the course, and we'll cover it this morning as well as this afternoon, is this idea of the crazy ones. Now, there's a great quote by Steve Jobs, it's the crazy ones who change the world because they think they can, and I go into that in a lot more detail in the course. And the challenge is for large corporates, like ourselves, to give space to the crazy ones and the innovators and the creatives that are able to disrupt from the inside, because COVID can disrupt from the outside, but then we all get quite focused on dealing with that external threat. Because it's external. When there's an internal disruption, you often have the internal competitiveness taking place. And we'll look at some examples as now, winners and losers. And Kodak, for example, had digital photographic technology, but because it was an internal disruption, they didn't take advantage of it. It wasn't seen as an existential threat. It wasn't seen as something that the whole organization had to respond to. It was only over time, when somebody else used that same technology and became an external threat to their organization, that they obviously then wake up too late. And it's about saying, how do we create a platform for those crazy ones, those people, those innovators, those teams, those thinkers, to chart a journey through disruptive innovation to successful processes and successful product lines for companies that otherwise would then become disrupted by the use of those technologies from outside. And of course, cloud is an important one. Cloud enables businesses to start up from scratch. It now enables businesses and individuals to start accessing services and to provide services almost with a zero cost base, certainly without having to invest in services or expensive infrastructure or call centers, etc. Taku asks about jobs lost due to digitization versus new opportunities. Absolutely, Taku. And I have another course called Man and the Machines, which talks about the impact on society through the rise of robots and automation. And what I talk about in the course there, and maybe just to answer your question, is that if you zoom out a little bit and you take a bit of a more historical perspective, but you can go right back to a group of people called the Luddites. And what the Luddites did was, they saw the cotton machinery and the cotton mills being automated, and our modern day equivalent you could call as digitization. And back then it was just machinery, doing more and more of a person's job for them, and the humans then having to grapple with the fact that more and more of their day-to-day work was being taken away by a machine, or was being done by a non-human actor in the process. Now, they protested and they broke the machinery, and I mean, you can see the waves of technological disruption and what they call waves of cycles of creative destruction over the years. And the simple, unquestionable fact is that humans have always been able to reinvent themselves. Humans have always been able to create more jobs than what were lost. That's a simple, undeniable fact, and the research has always shown that. And there is that initial disruption, there is the initial job loss, but then there's the correction, and you see the patterns. I mean, so as the work in the farms became automated, you saw humans migrate into city centers and urbanize and take on more knowledge workers and leverage and take advantage of the digital processes. The question, I think, which is still unsettled now, is just whether artificial intelligence and the exponential rise of technology means that rule is still going to continue, and whether in the future we won't get to what's called a singularity. And a singularity is where the machines then ultimately do, through artificial intelligence, actually take over humans' ability to reinvent themselves, and we then actually become a role player in a machine-dominated society. And there's lots of movies that talks about this. So really, I mean, that's I think, Taku, what you got to be thinking about as you look to the future is, for you as an individual, or the organization that you work for, or the degree that you're studying, how well does it position you to reinvent yourself, reinvent the roles that you think are being lost by digitization, so that you can create future employment if you're an employer, that you can position yourself for roles in an organization where you think there is a displacement or a rebalancing of the workforce in that organization because of digitization. And that's, I think, what these two webinars are aiming to do, is to give you some of the ideas that you can go in. And I'll make available my ebook as well just now, that you can download from Amazon and get the sort of tools and insights that you need to at least be familiar with these themes. And I'll also make available my Man and Machines course, which looks at a couple of case studies of automation. There's a great book called The War on Normal People. If you remember, one of the presidential candidates sort of ran on this ticket of giving all Americans $1,000 a month. Okay, and what this is universal basic income. And universal basic income says that because of the exponential growth of technology and digitization, there is now going to become this stage where the technology accelerates beyond which humans are able to reinvent themselves. And that as new wealth is created through digitization, that wealth then actually does need to be distributed. And that's this universal basic income, is that the exponential growth of technologies must also be used to lift the minimum, the sort of poverty line, etc. What we cannot have, and what I feel strongly about, is that digitization and technology shouldn't create hyper capitalism. So we've seen capitalism. Modern business world is built on the principles of capitalism, but we have many abuses and we have many unintended consequences of capitalism. Extensive gaps between the haves and the have-nots. And what we don't want is for digitization to extend that gap to unsustainable levels, which is what universal basic income is trying to achieve. So I'll pop a link onto the course just now. You can go into a little bit more detail about that. Pooja asks, can we touch on fintech, in particular cryptocurrency and use for auditing and banking? Yes, let's get to that under the financial services topic, which we will be getting to just now. But Calvin, any thoughts, from your perspective, this idea of jobs being lost due to digitization and humans reinventing themselves, and as an engineering faculty, and I mean as an engineer yourself, what role do we have in reinventing the workplace and our own approach to it, and the qualifications, etc., that we need to be able to deal with that massive disruption?
That's a great question, Peter. I actually think I read the World Economic Forum. They released a report I think late last year. It was called the Future of Jobs report. And I remember them mentioning that there will be a net creation of jobs as a result of all this disruption. So that's good news. But the bad news is that we need to constantly try and position ourselves, like you said, to be on the right side of that shift. As students entering the workforce, I think that's very, very important. And I'm hoping maybe you can touch on a few of those, maybe little skills that we can do outside of our typical degrees that maybe will allow us to understand these concepts better. Because I know for a fact that I don't learn about blockchain coding at university. It's quite an advanced concept, but it's something I'd like to learn about. But we don't necessarily have that level. We're not at that level yet. So maybe there's a few tips you can give us. But I do think it's important that we understand how this technology is shaping industries, because we're going to be entering the workforce soon. Yeah, so I think that is really, really important, definitely.
Okay, great. Thanks, Calvin. Let's certainly pick up on that as we go through the conversation. Okay, guys, great. Thanks for the comments and thanks for being here this afternoon. Great to have you along for the discussion. I think it's important, as Calvin said, that we all get to grips with these types of issues. And maybe one of the ways of getting to grips with it is also to look back in history, and you don't have to look far back in history to see the massive disruption that has happened in the business world. So on this slide, the next one, and it's a whole lecture in the course that I go into, is the digital winners and losers. So Walkman there, for example, were obviously disrupted by the iPod Shuffle. Now, interestingly, the iPod Shuffle itself has then been disrupted by the iPhone. And interestingly, that was within the same company. So Apple disrupted themselves. They disrupted their own product line to save themselves, because if they hadn't converged media and voice onto the same device, somebody else would have done it, and the iPhone would have been a Me Too product. So you'd still do get some iPod Shuffles out there in the market, but obviously they had a massive drop off. Once they put sound libraries onto their smartphones. And of course, I think the Netflix Blockbuster story is very well known. Blockbuster were obviously the biggest DVD rental network, physical network in America. And it's iconic that you would go down to the local Blockbuster, pick up a DVD, for Friday, Saturday night, whatever. That people never thought that human behavior would change to the degree that it has, where it's now a streaming environment of, click and watch, in the comfort of your own home. And I guess with the impact of COVID on cinemas, it's accelerated that trend even more. And I actually went into my DVD shop the other day, actually, and I asked them, how their business was going. And it was actually quite interesting, because they said, no, very good, actually, because there's a lot of specialist titles that are only ever going to be on, they'll never be converted into a streaming format because Netflix will have to license them and so on. And so what you find is that DVDs, and in actual fact, Kodak didn't actually, it still operates, and it offers very specialized services for very specialized photographers and types of photographs, etc. But Netflix actually proposed a Blockbuster in, I think, 99, 2000 to run the website for Blockbuster. And they said, look, we think that, with this internet coming along, people are going to be able to, go onto your website and then order a DVD to be delivered instead of having to come pick it up. Because if they can get all the same information on the website that they would going into the store, then they might choose to come onto your website. And we've got an idea for your website. We'd like to run your website. And there is a good story that you can go read up about where the Blockbuster executives actually threw them out of the boardroom, and then from there Netflix was born as a kind of a reaction to that whole story and to almost prove them wrong. And little did they realize that beyond ordering DVDs online, they would go into streaming. And what had to happen there, obviously, was the increased technology around the bandwidth and the capacity of our networks, etc., across the internet and across our worldwide internet cabling infrastructure to handle that degree of streaming. And I don't know if you saw, but during lockdowns last year, Netflix actually had to throttle its the resolution and its capacity simply to save space for all of the other traffic that was now having to be passed through the internet cabling infrastructure. So, just quite interesting how a combination of things, so the rise of the internet as a means for, getting access to something, as well as the rise of the capacity and the technology and the quality of the bandwidth, then resulting in the actual streaming that came through as a result of that. So although the originally intended business model wasn't one that ended up, it was a couple of combinations that resulted in that. And when we talk about digital transformation in the next webinar, I'll talk about some of the cultural aspects and things that need to be in place for companies to take advantage of digitization, etc. So here's a few more examples. We spoke about Kodak. I mentioned that one earlier. They had the technology for digital photography. They had it in the late 80s, in fact, and obviously the executives were worried that it was going to disrupt their physical films business, and they squashed it. And they said, look, we don't see this being a big thing. And yet, if they had sort of embraced it and been willing to, disrupt themselves, they could have been the leaders. But if you look at what actually ultimately disrupted them, was not the technology itself, but the clever use of technology by 14 people in a garage, which at that time called themselves Instagram, went through a bunch of ups and downs, nearly went out of business a couple of times, but ended up becoming the most popular app for the creation and sharing of photographs in a much more socialized context, right? So off the back of social media and how humans started to engage with each other in that context, photographs then became a critical aspect of that. And as we know, Instagram was bought by Facebook simply because of how well it complemented their social media business. And as we mentioned just now, Sony held on to the iconic Walkman to their detriment. Sony also had digital sound library technology. They could have done it, but they thought that everyone would carry that iconic Walkman forever. So, part of the trick is human behavior and how it can be very fickle and fast changing. Google thought they would bet on the Google Glass, but what ended up was nobody wanted to wear a GoPro on their head at all times. It was cool for the extreme sports and the skiers and the snow jumpers, etc. But for people to walk around with glasses, and people weren't sure if you were looking at them through your physical eye or your digital eye, that was going to cross a barrier that at that time was too much of a leap for that technology. Now, there's no doubt it will reemerge in some form at a later stage. But there are many examples in addition to these of where technology has failed to disrupt and failed to take hold of what people thought was a shift in human behavior. Then maybe the last two there, SMS and WhatsApp, and you'll have seen the papers in South Africa, Vodacom and MTN, and even now there's still, I believe, legislation to try and control Netflix and WhatsApp and all these what they call over-the-top service providers. And even in the banking industry, we have the same with the aggregators that will aggregate multiple services. If you look at hippo.co.za or First for Women in the insurance space, these are just aggregators, and they will shop around in the insurance providers, for the best products, aggregate those to you based on your profile, and give you the best recommendation, so that you, in theory, get the best of all options that you would consider. And that's a classic example of over-the-top services. WhatsApp, SMS actually didn't cost the telcos anything to carry, 140 characters. It physically didn't have a variable cost attached to it. And it became abused with spam, and it was never socialized into groups. And WhatsApp saw that humans wanted to interact much more in a group context, and that's where their massively famous groups then ultimately, created that exponential growth onto that platform. And I think people have been watching WhatsApp to see if they're going to put advertising on there now, and if people are going to shift onto other messaging platforms like Telegram, etc. But there's privacy concerns, obviously, because WhatsApp is now also owned by Facebook. So Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, there's massive amounts of data, being owned there in the hands of a very few number of people. And again, linking back to my previous point around the risks of digitally enabled hypercapitalism, creating these unfair advantage of, the Googles and the Facebooks having access to massive amounts of data, which they can obviously then, use to significant advantage. And I guess, just to touch on privacy and data for a minute, there is legislation that is looking at breaking up big tech and maybe forcing a bit of a data tax, because ultimately it's us. We're the product now. We are the product. It is our data that is being used in these platforms and in these engines to make product recommendations, and to drive advertising, through the attention that these social media platforms are able to attract from us as humans. Okay, so a few winners and losers there in the digital space. And as we mentioned previously, if you kind of map this out in a business model, you'll see that it follows a fairly specific pattern. You've got this early growth as companies digitize, and then deceptively, they're growing and growing, because 10 users, double 10 users is only 20 users. You double that, you get 40, then 80. And just like the chessboard, if you're aware of how chess came into being, the person who invented chess, asked, he was offered a prize, and he said, I like rice, and I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first block, 2 on the next, 4 on the next, 8, 16, 32, etc. And they couldn't calculate how much rice to give him by the time it got to the 64th block, never mind even the 32nd block, I think. And today we've calculated that to be enough rice to cover the Earth's surface 3 meters deep or something ridiculous. So once you get these exponential principles kicking in, whether it's user numbers or profitability or, watch time on YouTube or number of searches on Google, etc., you get this compound effect driven by networks. And network effects, what happens is that the value of any new additional person joining the network or participating in that ecosystem adds value to everybody else that's already in the ecosystem. So you wouldn't be on Facebook if your friends weren't there. I know we spoke about Facebook last time. A lot of people have shut down their Facebook accounts. Equally, you wouldn't be on Uber if you couldn't be guaranteed of getting a ride within 5 minutes. And that's because everybody else is on Uber also demanding the same service. So that you get this exponential growth of an over-concentration of buyers and sellers, creating then multitudes of benefit for everybody else, but obviously then, hyper-capitalism and extreme profits for the people that own and run those platforms. You'll have seen the dispute between the Fortnite game and Apple, and I wrote an article about that. I'll share that into the link just now. And you can see there that Fortnite tried to dispute the payments that they owed Apple for using the platform, and they wanted to go directly to their gamers. So the platform owners, obviously run the platforms, create the ecosystem for the buyers and the sellers to come in there. And as long as that ecosystem has fair and equitable value for everybody, then it continues to work. But if one party or a dominant party decides to extract itself or rebel, then you can weaken the whole ecosystem. And that's really what drives this extreme growth and the exponential growth that we've seen in these companies, and which has ultimately disrupted not only industries but also societies. If you look at democratization, the Arab Spring, let's not forget, it wasn't that long ago that governments were overthrown through the power of the internet and citizens' ability to organize and to protest through internet. Dictators, the first thing they'll often do to prevent citizens uprising is switch off the internet, switch off messaging apps, switch off Twitter, switch off WhatsApp, etc. So those platforms, beyond industry, financial related considerations, have driven democratization. They've actually birthed democracy, and not been the only factor in it, but obviously been a vehicle for it. So as much as they're criticized, I mean, if you look back in time at those type of events, there has been an important role of those platforms and the internet.
Peter, sorry if I can quickly jump in there.
Yeah.
What I've got a question. What is your kind of opinion on what stage South Africa is in that kind of step-by-step process that we saw in the previous slide, in terms of the digital disruption landscape here in South Africa? As I mean, most of those companies we've spoken about, are American or European. What have you kind of sensed? What is it like in South Africa at the moment?
A couple of thoughts. I mean, I think the important thing is that you cannot skip steps. So when you're talking about the digitization of an economy, and maybe let's just go back to that slide, the challenge here is that there are steps before that first digitization step there, right? So there's basic infrastructure needs, there's basic connectivity requirements that have to be in place before you can get the benefits of digitization. Now, there is a degree to which you can leapfrog. So, across Africa, as was your question, the number of mobile handsets, eclipse the number of landlines, and leapfrog that technology. But, I would argue that it could never leapfrog the lack of electricity, for example. It could never leapfrog the lack of, basic infrastructure to go and build cell towers and high sites and all the other things that are much lower down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs for human beings. If we don't have water, if we don't have shelter, if we don't have food, we're not going to want to be on Facebook or message each other. So I think, Calvin, there are those basic infrastructure requirements that need to be in place. But there are some other examples of where, leapfrogs have happened. So I think there's arguments to both of those. In the South African context specifically, the challenge, I think, is around automation. I think 40% of all work opportunities can be automated. So you have much more the gig economy, short-term contract type of work happening in South Africa. So from a plus perspective, from a positive perspective, we're already fairly used to that way of working. So I think, we haven't had that length of time as a society for us to be entrenched in the long-term career. I think overseas, and in the longer-term economies, they've had to the worker environment has shifted from that longer-term career to the gig worker world. Whereas I think we've, as a country, much more familiar and I think comfortable with a gig economy type of short-term contract worker type of world. However, that said, a lot of those work opportunities, as I mentioned, are ripe for automation and digitization. And the question is then, how many of those steps of building an educated workforce can you potentially skip out until you're able to take advantage of a much more digitized economy that an educated workforce is actually going to be able to take advantage of? Never mind whether we can produce the scientists and the data scientists that are able to design the algorithms that can avoid the bias that is often entrenched in those algorithms and in those artificially intelligent machines, that is often the result of biased programmers that then create those algorithms, because those machines are only as good as either, number one, the data set that you train those algorithms on, or number two, the designers of those algorithms. So I firmly believe that we need African artificial intelligence designers, coders, developers. And in actual fact, at a recent webinar, I shared that Google has just launched its Africa Scholarship, specifically focused on African scholars, with a $30,000 stipend to support artificially intelligent related research, which I think is critical to balance, what is perceived as a very Western-dominated roadmap, for automation and artificial intelligence. So those would be a couple of thoughts there, Calvin. And the last thought I would be is just to say, how much our whole economy is still dependent on a very manual labor business model, and how much our jobs and education and degrees and qualifications are geared towards training people for those highly manual roles. And if those roles are then disrupted, you've got a pipeline of people coming into jobs that no longer exist. And then, as we spoke about previously at the beginning of the session, you've got this disruption and people needing to reinvent themselves. People then will go back to the first principles of their education and say, well, how do I reinvent myself? But if you don't have the basics in place, and we still need to determine what exactly that is. So should we teach coding at school, for example? Should we teach blockchain at school? Should we teach more entrepreneurialism at school? Should we teach data science a lot more at school? Because if a person comes out of a school, university environment and there's no job for them, what are they going to fall back on to reinvent themselves, to circle around that challenge in their lives? And if they can go back and say, well, hang on a sec, I learned coding at school, I can go back to that skill. Or I learned X or Y or Z. And that's where education, I think, has to start anticipating the role of the future. And I spoke at St. Stithians a couple of years ago about exactly these issues and what the classroom of the future potentially is going to look like. And we've had an experiment in that in 2020, because we had no classrooms. We had no physical classrooms. We had the world's biggest learn and work from home experiment that we've ever seen. And so hopefully, schools and universities and companies have taken the learnings from that massive experiment and hopefully apply them to disrupt themselves from within, rather than wait for it to happen from the outside. So just a couple of these pointers, which I go into some detail in the lecture, in the course, which really just unpack, not only that exponential growth curve, but some more specific examples of how that happens and what the forces are at play. And then we mentioned, financial services and banking, and a couple of thoughts on this topic. On the left-hand side there, what we've seen is, telecommunications using their networks and using their accessibility, to customers, then to, add payments and add money transfer and add, those more financially inclusive types of products to their customers, in a hope of, eating away at the market share of the dominant banks. And our response, I guess, has been to build similar products, as well as then to offer the connectivity. So you'll see, for example, FNB offering its own connect-to-customer offering, which we run off of the CellC network. As you know, if you've got an FNB SIM card, we obviously are then the over-the-top provider of your mobile value network, but it's still then the utility of CellC on the back end. So you get this weird cross-pollination of utility and over-the-top. The telco try and provide the over-the-top service of the banking, and then are the utility of the network, and the bank provides the telco, and they have the utility on the telco, the telco providers on the telco networks. So everyone is playing in everybody else's space, and Bitcoin has come along and said, well, forget about existing business models and players. Here is a brand new decentrally managed model for the storing and the exchange of value. And it's one in which doesn't require a third party to underwrite that transaction, simply because the power in the algorithm of the blockchain network and what's called the proof of work is that everybody can see everybody else's transactions. And the blockchain is literally a series of blocks of transactions that are mathematically unchangeable. Okay, those transactions cannot be manipulated because of the mathematics of that original blockchain paper that was written, and that mathematics persists in the blockchain today. What you see is the use cases of blockchain coming through in different cryptocurrencies. We spoke about cryptocurrencies earlier, and you have Bitcoin and Ethereum and lots of other are just use cases of blockchain. And what's important, I think, for us to understand is the power of the blockchain, is the power of the network, is the power of the indisputable law of the wisdom of the crowd. So if Calvin and I are in a bar and I buy Calvin a drink, and the next day I said, did you, how was your beer last night? He says, no, you didn't buy me a drink. Well, I can turn to our buddy John standing on the left. I say, well, I did buy Calvin a drink, So there's the power of the crowd that says, well, I can't dispute the transaction because everybody saw the transaction. Now, where people have lost faith in banks, and we saw this in 2008 with the global banking crisis, was it because banks said, trust us, trust us. We're the underwriting participant in all financial transactions so that you can't fail. Actually, when they did fail, there was almost systemic failure, and the governments obviously had to step in to protect the banking system. Blockchain is a very, cryptocurrencies is a usage of blockchain as a response to that, to say, well, let the networks decide, let the networks verify the transactions, let the value be stored and transmitted in technology, and let us prove that the network can keep that blockchain store and exchange of value as incorruptible and do a better job of it than the banks can. And I think what you'll see going forward is most probably banks adopting blockchain-based products and participating in more closed blockchain ecosystems. There are certainly a lot of use cases using blockchain, for example, in trade and deeds management and other more non-money based transactions for which we need to keep an undisputed record of. So share trading, for example, investments, etc. The idea of replacing money with cryptocurrencies, I think is one that will still have quite a long way to run. But could I envisage a world where on the FNB app you can manage your Bitcoin balance? No, it's not inconceivable. I mean, we already do. You can buy a lotto ticket, on your app. So again, it's going to be the race for dominance in ecosystems of customers where you can provide simple and intuitive services for them to manage their lives better. Okay, let's just move on then quickly. So I think we've spoken about a couple of these things here, and in actual fact, that's me with Nedbank's Pepper robot. So Nedbank obviously did quite a large robotic experiment, where they put Pepper into their branches to actually interact with customers. So automation, can come in many different formats. And for me, this is automation or digitization of a channel or an interaction with a customer. And really what digital transformation actually requires is a much more fundamental, re-engineering of your back-end processes all the way through to your front end. You can put a robot in your branch, but if you don't have the processes and the quality of data behind that, which is equally well digitized and optimized, then you've just automated the front of a frustrating process. And I guess really that talks to this discontinuity of innovation, where you have to go through some radical disruption to get to products that genuinely move the needle in terms of customer expectations and how they create value. You can't improve a horse-drawn cart to develop a car. There's no pathway of incremental improvement from one to the other. You have to be a crazy one, as we mentioned, and stand outside of that and say, I've got a new way of doing that. Because if you ask that rider of the horse-drawn cart what he wants to improve his transportation system, he's going to say, give me a faster horse. Whereas Thomas Edison reimagined that entire transport system. Now, if we come back to the question that was asked earlier on, the horse population of America has had an exponential decay. And horses, whereas they were obviously used for every horse-drawn cart, and there was actually a whole, jobs market in New York, for example, of people who used to clean up the streets after the horses, was completely disrupted. And one of the arguments against bringing in motor vehicles into New York City was, well, what are we going to do with all the people that clean up after all the horses? So the valid questions, but those people then reinvented themselves, took on more advanced jobs as those jobs were no longer required or were automated. And I think failure is an important one there. Thomas Edison, had a culture of radical experimentation, and he was willing to fail 9,999 times simply because you could not improve a candle to get to a light bulb. And even the filament light bulb itself has now been disrupted by LED and other technology. So these waves of cyclical destruction will continue. But as I've said, humans have so far been able to stay ahead of them. And I guess the question is whether that will continue on into the future, where we have a an artificially intelligent dominated technology that we have to deal with. Then cloud, just the last topic to touch on today is really just an infrastructure disruption, and really I guess it's got to be balanced against the need for privacy and how governments are regulating the location of that customer data, which becomes a little bit of a question mark, because the ultimate place at which that customer record is stored in its master form is very much open to interpretation. And again, it's got to be balanced between job protection and the advancement and the improvement and the progression of societies, whereby if we don't embrace cloud, you're going to have potential loss of access to cloud-based services in continents where it's absolutely critical and might be needed for medical and education and other reasons. So within companies, we're moving our infrastructures into the cloud so that we don't have, expensive brick and mortar server centers that we have to maintain. So massive benefits of scale there. Okay, so just quickly then, guys, that are still on the webinar, this is the course, and I'll put a link to it now. Calvin, you've done the course. Any thoughts from your side, having done the course and read the book?
Yeah, both were great. Guys, I highly recommend them. It'll keep you in touch with digital, especially if you go for a job interview and you can speak the lingo and have dialogue about that stuff. It's really impressive. And then also, it also helps break barriers between you and professionals, and that helps you build connections as well. So I think it's a great course, and the book is invaluable, guys. If you can grab that book and keep it for the rest of your life, it'll lead you in good stead. But the point is that things change, guys, and the status quo must be challenged ultimately. So get up to date with these topics. If you didn't really catch everything, it's really invaluable. I sent 2 links on the chat there. I don't know if they can see them, Peter. One was the Future of Jobs report, so you guys can have a look at that. It might give you some interesting tips. And then a great book for blockchain that I read this year called The Truth Machine. I sent a link where you can, if you want to purchase that online. But yeah, otherwise, guys, I mean, Peter's stuff is really concise and succinct. You won't have to spend too much time going into the hairy details. So I really recommend them.
Thanks, Calvin. Appreciate that product endorsement there. So I showed you the course on the previous page, and then there's the book actually reviewed by Calvin as well. So appreciate just the voiceover that you've given us there. So please hop onto those links and grab those. And then Calvin's also provided a couple of articles, which I've just copy pasted into the chat as well. And then if I may, just to let you guys know about the student success coach community and a lot of other value that you can get when you become part of that. And what we've spoken about this afternoon comes out of my digital masterclass course, and then I've got the Man of Machines course, and there's 25 other courses. There's a number there which are quite specialized around supporting your academic success, but then also related to a number of other business topics. And the link that I put in there to the Facebook group really is the community aspect of it. And then on the YouTube channel, which is where you are now, and I'd really like it if everybody can just hop onto that link and subscribe, and then you'll get all the updates, you'll get these webinars, you'll get future sessions. And what I often do is I go back into webinars and I pick up a lot of the questions that I wasn't able to get to, and I produce specific Q&A videos answering those questions. So there's lots of more value that you can get on the YouTube channel. So I'd really invite you to subscribe in there. And then something that I launched in January of this year, which was really, I think, just to, mark the movement from a difficult year of 2020 on into year of 2021, hopefully with a lot more inspiration and success in all of our lives, and hopefully starting to get past COVID and the difficulties that it's caused, is a weekly podcast of interviews with students and academic leaders that really gets into the nuts and bolts of what it means to be successful as a student. What are some of the examples that you can draw inspiration from? And I love podcasts because you can get away from a screen, you can go for a walk, get some exercise, listen in your car, etc. And if you subscribe there, you'll get those weekly episodes. And some of the highlights that we've had in the first season has been an interview with the postgraduate coordinator at Wits Engineering, talks about, his perspective on doing postgraduate studies and what that takes to be successful. We also interviewed the president of the convocation of it. We've had a couple of people from Tukkies as well, and a couple of other universities, and of course people who've got their PhDs and their masters, and people who are still going through it. And I think just very local stories that you can get lots of inspiration from there on the podcast. So guys, I think that's really about it from my side. And then, we'll see you in the next webinar. And I think if we can just get the message out there and maybe just pop an email reminder out there again, Calvin, that would be great. Let everybody know that it's happening. And we'll see you in that session for, a discussion around digital transformation. And the last link I've put there is just my mailing list, where you'll be able to get, lots more value. And when I pop out updates to courses, and it just means we can maintain a relationship. If you're willing to give me your details, I can pop you on that list. And there's a sign-up form that when you just go onto that link, it's very easy and seamless. And hopefully you'll get lots more value through that relationship that we'll have through that mailing list. Calvin, anything else from your side? And then we'll call it a day and see each other at the next webinar.
Cool beans. I just wanted to say thank you firstly to Peter for the time again, taking out of your day to come and inspire us and really just share your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. And then to all the students that came today, I really appreciate it. A lot of efforts put into these webinars, and I find them little nuggets of gold. And on Fridays, I really enjoyed them, and I thought that would be a great idea to have more of them, especially for engineering and built environments and IT students. So I really appreciate your attendance, guys, and maybe just share with your friends, like Peter said, so we can share more knowledge. And thank you again, and have an awesome week. And we'll see you on Wednesday, I believe.
Definitely. Thanks all. Appreciate the time, and have a good week further. Chat soon.